Hello and welcome to Who is Delaying Climate Action in Massachusetts? The song you just heard is from, unfortunately, a very old show that's very appropriate called Fiorello. In the natural sciences, there's a thing called a keystone species. So, for instance, bees are a keystone species because if bees do not pollinate the male with the female, we do not have the plants. If they do not pollinate the plants, the Homo sapiens do not get the food. They are keystones. Same thing with beavers who make wetlands. Species live on them. They also protect the drier parts of the world. Beavers are keystone. And the Brown Report that we're going to hear about today is very much about keystone issues. If we can't move these, we cannot move climate and make a safe tomorrow. And those issues are about the outsized amount of power that lobbyists have with money. It's about the need for term limits on our speaker. It is about transparency and being able to see where votes are. And so we have three very wonderful people that are going to talk about these issues and how they manifest in our legislature and why we're not seeing change. So please let us welcome the authors of the Brown Report. We have Timmons Roberts. He is the Idelson Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology at Brown University and the Direct Climate and Development Lab. It's really interesting. It's a new global organization and it functions on understanding climate obstruction. He's taught at William and Mary, Tulane, James Martin. He's a James Martin 21st Century Professor at Oxford's Environmental Change Institute, and he is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He serves on the Rhode Island Climate Change Commission, which he and some students from Brown wrote into law. And Timmons, very much like us at 350, he really cares passionately about how equity is part of all of these issues. So I think you're going to feel that our desires for change and the things he has to offer are going to fit perfectly into one another. And he comes to us today with two wonderful young men, Trevor Culhane, who's a 215 Brown graduate and now a researcher in the Climate and Development Lab. And he worked with Rhode Island Student Climate Coalition to pass legislation. And he wrote his thesis. How many of us, just wave presenters, how many of us were at the Big People's Climate March in Washington? Yes. I even have the t-shirt with the big round, the fists and the feet. And he wrote about the messaging of that for his PhD. I thought, what a really interesting thing. He also authored some fabulous articles on Brown's tacit acceptance of the militarization of our police. Thank you, Trevor, for doing that. And he has a focus on the industrial actors here in New England that are stopping strong climate legislation. And then the third author of the report, and I know he's going to flash up now, Galen. I'm waiting for him to flash up. There he is. Hi, Galen. Galen just graduated in physics last year in 2020, and he works for the same lab at Brown. He works with Brown Climate Action now. He authored and co-authored lots of articles on everything from divestment to cutting the university's tie with deniers and our bizarre obsession with economic growth that has got to turn into our bizarre obsession with sustainability, let us hope. And so let me pass it to the gentleman of the Brown Report.
Thank you very much, Judith. And I want to say for us that we are very pleased to be here tonight because when we took up this research, wanted it to be useful for people who are working to advance climate action in the States. We really felt like there's an area of sort of an unknown territory, the terra incognita for most people in the climate sphere, and that is all this work that's being done very quietly behind the closed doors on lobbying and the many other things like campaign contributions, public relations campaigns, think tanks, university support, and on, and philanthropy being done by the fossil fuel industry and its allies. And we're going to talk about tonight at the state level, which is even less research than the federal level. So we had some funding from the Barr Foundation to study Massachusetts and Connecticut to build on some pilot research we did here in Rhode Island, where I've been working for about 12 years, sort of in the trenches to help advance climate action. And as you mentioned, Trevor, as an undergraduate, worked on some of that back when he was undergraduate, and we continue to work on it here in the state. We're now working on Connecticut this year. So Galen's going to pull up some slides, hopefully, and we can get this rolling. I need to be as quick as I can because I need to save time for them. We have a lot to say. We have really systematically collected records of all the lobbying and all the testimony in the Massachusetts legislature from 2013 to 2018. And the period is important because that was when the data was available. We sort of camped out in the State House Library on Beacon Hill. We went back repeatedly to talk to the staffers in the different committees where we were asking for their testimony records. Many of them, it was very difficult to get. Much of it was not available. We got every piece that was available, especially from every piece of the priority legislation of the major coalitions that are working to advance climate action in the state. So there's been a lot of work behind this. Unfortunately, that is also the period when climate policy did not advance in Massachusetts. So there was, of course, we acknowledged the important and the huge accomplishments of the Global Warming Solutions Act before that period, and then the passage of the big climate next generation roadmap legislation that just was signed into law finally this year as a result of the work of many of you. But we think that there's important structural problems to advancing climate action, and that will make it difficult, and also is really important in the implementation phase. So we hope this is useful. Next slide. So just very quickly, the sooner we act, the easier it is. And the longer we wait, the harder it is. You all know this, right? If we had just started and peaked our carbon emissions in 2011, we could have reduced it just 3.5% or 3.7% a year to stay below 1.5 degrees. But now we have to reduce it 9% a year. It's quickly becoming nearly impossible without withdrawal of climate change causing gases. Next. The obvious place to do this action on climate change would be at the federal level. Of course, Obama tried to do some of this, and there was the Waxman-Markey bill in 2008 and 2009. Next slide. But there is, of course, been obstruction in the Senate, this very difficult hurdle, this sort of veto gate, as the political scientists call it, where legislation gets stopped if you don't have 60 votes. So it really is in the hands of very few. This picture is from when they were doing a procedural vote to block essentially the Green New Deal legislation in March of 2019. Next. Every time there's real chance of legislation at the federal level, the lobbying spending booms. And here's some research by my colleague, Robert Brule, who we've brought to Brown and who is my co-leader in this thing that Judith mentioned, which I encourage you to look into sometime. It's called the Climate Social Science Network, or CSSN, cssn.org. And that is our global network. And he shows that, with the possibility of the passage of the Waxman-Markey bill in 2008, 2009, that the lobbying spending went from about 50 million a year to about 350 million a year. And you can also note that it didn't really quite go all the way back to where it was. Next. So we think Massachusetts is a great case study. And first of all, states are fantastic. There's 50 different cases, or 51 if you include the district. And each of them have different politics, different geographical vulnerability. We had in Massachusetts these super majorities in both chambers. Of course, high vulnerability to sea level rise, and a very progressive, seemingly, according to polling data, and highly interested in climate action population. So we think it's kind of a best case scenario. But yet we saw this big slowdown and really a blockage on climate legislation for really the decade of the teens. Next. This is an example of an effort of the utilities across the country to block electrification, which many studies and most environmental experts and activists are saying, of course, is the way we're going to deal with climate change is to electrify our cars, our home heating, and everything else that we can. And this is a specific quiet effort by the utilities that sell natural gas to basically make it so that people are sort of object to being forced to electrify their homes. So these issues of choice, that gas is more affordable, that electrification is going to be too hard and too expensive. So these are sort of the talking points that they pushed out, and they're pushing out right now. And of course, we had Eversource in that group. Next. So our big questions in this research project were who supports and opposes climate and clean energy legislation? How do the groups interact? Just so we're just collecting the most basic data. Who shows up at the legislature? What do they want? What do the groups focus on? Which ones focus on which issues, and how do they argue for their priorities? When do they lobby? Are there certain coalitions on certain issues, but not on other issues? And who wins and loses? And how do the winners use the legislative process to get what they want? So next, I'm going to hand it off to Trevor, who's going to talk about the testifying, and then we'll have Galen about the lobbying data. Trevor.
Yeah, so every bill in Massachusetts is heard in a hearing. So anyone can sign up and speak at that hearing. And these hearings give us a good sense of who the actors are who choose to show up publicly and speak on climate bills and clean energy bills. So this gives us a sense of like the public advocacy that happens. And then Galen will talk about lobbying and some of the private lobbying and advocacy that happens. So for testimony, what we did was we collected testimony on priority bills that a few environmental groups saw as key issue bills from 2013 to 2018. And for each piece of testimony we were able to collect, we looked at three things. We looked at who gave that testimony. So here's the Mass Association of Realtors. We looked at the position they took on that bill. So here it's opposed to this bill. And then we looked at some of the arguments that they used. And so in total, we got about 1,400 positions on 50 different bills on climate and clean energy. So looking ahead at the results here, in green here is a position taken in support of environmental group. And red is a position taken against the environmental group, and gray is neutral. And so the first really big thing we see here is that testimony in these committees is about 9-to-1 in support of climate action. So really across different sessions, across different issues, we see really strong support in these hearings for environmental groups' positions on climate bills. The second thing we see here is opposition is pretty rare, and opposition is limited to specific sectors. So we see heating oils, fossil fuels, utilities, and real estate all give most of their testimony against environmentalists. The other important thing to note with the opposition here is that these numbers are very small, right? This is over a 6-year period, over 50 bills. So we're seeing that most of these groups, even though they are pretty well resourced and are pretty strongly opposed, at least in testimony, to these bills, are not choosing to show up publicly in these hearings to speak out against bills. And then the third thing we see is there's really strong individual support. So individuals, that just means people who aren't officially paid as part of an organization, aren't officially representing the organization, give most of the testimony that we see here. And really almost all of it is in support of climate action. The opposition there was some individual opposition, but most of it was limited to some wind siting bills in 2013. And only one person in our entire data set actually denied climate change, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about in the future. So we can go next.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Trevor. So I'm going to move on and talk about the lobbying data and analysis that we used in this study. And I should say, if my Wi-Fi goes out or something, someone just yell at me and I'll walk back. So lobbying records in Massachusetts are kind of unique, both nationally and for the state. They're unique nationally because they're very high fidelity. So there's a lot of information we can get out of lobbying records. And that's unique in the state because there are a lot of transparency problems that plague the legislature in other areas. So this is sort of a nice window into activities that are otherwise sort of opaque to us. So lobbying disclosures in Massachusetts tell us who paid for lobbying. So a client, this example, the utility Eversource, the firm they paid, the lobbyist that firm paid, and then every bill that that lobbyist recorded lobbying on for their client, as well as the position that they lobbied for their client. So we combined those records on lobbying with a list of 291 relevant bills. So we found all the bills relating to climate change and clean energy policy over our time period, 2013 to 2018. And then we added some extra data on those bills, like votes, which committee they were in, who sponsored them, and what happened to them from this service Legiscan. So I'm going to sort of drill down from top level findings to sort of more nuanced findings that we can pull out of these data. So the sort of top level finding that's good to know is if you just compare the top interest groups who support the most bills related to climate change against those who oppose the most bills related to climate change, the climate advocates are outspent by more than 3.5 to 1 on lobbying budgets. So if you look at this figure here was actually put together by Inside Climate News based on our report. And it just shows those top 10 advocates and those top 10 opponents and the amount that they spent on lobbying over the whole period that we studied. That 3.5 to 1 number is actually probably an underestimate of the ratio because we include this Mass Municipal Association, which is sort of a sort of niche lobbying group in here. And if you exclude them, the number goes to more like 6.5 to 1. So there's just a vast disparity in the resources that groups on both sides can put towards lobbying. But we wanted to drill down and see, once we have this lobbying data, can we sort of figure out who is on different sides of different issues? Climate change is not just one issue. There's lots of different things going on in energy policy. The way we do that is we construct first a network of interest groups, signified by these gray dots here, and the bills they lobbied on, which are all these little black dots. So the example here is Environmental League of Massachusetts and National Grid, which is a utility. And the green lines here signify that Environmental League of Massachusetts lobbied for a bill. The red lines mean the interest group lobbied against the bill, and gray lines indicate what's termed neutral lobbying. So we take a network like this, so we link lots of different interest groups to all the bills they lobbied, and then we collapse it down by looking at the agreements and disagreements between interest groups over bills that they both lobbied on. So when ELM and National Grid both lobby against a bill or both lobby for a bill, that counts as an agreement, and the other cases count as disagreements. What we want is to look at a network that just relates interest groups to other interest groups based on how often their preferences on climate policy coincide. This is what that network looks like. I know it's a bit of a mess, but I'll explain it. So there are 160 interest groups that lobbied consistently on multiple climate bills in our data set. When we collapse that two-part network down to just interest groups, and then we cluster them based on those that have the most similar set of preferences on policies, we find that there are 9 clusters of interest groups sort of broadly split into 5 that tend to support climate legislation and 4 that tend to oppose it. So I'll get into who is showing up to oppose and support climate legislation briefly. This is just another way of looking at it where those clusters have been collapsed into pie charts where the ratios show how much they lobby for and against climate legislation. And again, I'll get back to that. So the sort of top level finding here is that there's a big set of social green, that means environmental and progressive groups in Massachusetts, who sort of center the pro-climate interest groups. And the most active members of this Green Coalition on lobbying specifically are Environmental League of Massachusetts, Clean Water Action, and Conservation Law Foundation. Those are the groups with the most the most records. And then conversely, there's a sort of coalition of different anti-green groups. That's how we term them. So there are utility companies and related industries. There are fossil and chemical producers. There are fossil fuel-based power generators and real estate companies. The most active members in those opposition groups are National Grid, the American Petroleum Institute, and Eversource. What we really want, though, is to look at this by issue. So we want to see, in a certain issue space, like let's say hydro and wind power bills, how do the different interest groups in Massachusetts line up? Who's on which side of these different issues? So here I'm showing how we do that. We basically do the same analysis I just described, but we only look at interest groups lobbying on legislation in one issue space. So here I've highlighted the bills that pertain to hydro, power, and wind. What we find is that on different issues, there are differing alignments and oppositions between these sets of interest groups. So there have been a few bills over the time period that we studied to build out hydro and wind power, or import hydro power and build out wind power. And on those bills, there was this sort of triangle of mutual support between hydro and wind companies, obviously, social green groups, and the utilities, which is a little bit more surprising. Whereas fossil fuel power generators clearly saw a threat from these legislations, so they opposed it. Conversely, on solar power bills, there's a very different pattern. So as you would expect, social green groups and solar power companies support solar power bills. So there's this sort of mutual support there. But utilities strongly lobby against them, and the same goes for power generators. So you see that even just varying the type of generation changes the landscape of lobbying significantly. So, oops, sorry, I'm going to turn it back to Trevor to talk a little bit more about what these interest groups specifically want.
Yeah, so I'm just going to kind of synthesize both the testimony that we saw, as well as the lobbying coalitions that Galen talked about, to talk about the kind of like the big three opposition coalitions that we looked at. So the first one is the utilities. So as Galen was saying, they're supporting large-scale hydro and wind, but are really strongly attacking solar energy. They're also pretty involved in trying to control energy efficiency policies to be most beneficial to them. So this is a quote from testimony from Eversource. And they're saying here, we can do the same for the environment, but at a fraction of the cost with more wind than solar. So utilities arguments in general tend to sound very neutral. You can see here, this is a kind of like a neutral cost sounding argument. They don't strongly attack solar, but we know that they lobby heavily against solar. And they know that in general, utilities have a lot more potential to profit from large scale hydro and wind than they do from small scale solar, and particularly solar net metering, which cuts into their profits. So the next coalition, the fossil fuel industry. Fossil fuel industry barely ever supported any of the bills that we looked at. So they're really looking to block threats and to kind of stem back the tide of climate action in the state. So their arguments tend to be a lot more bold and aggressive. So this is a quote from the American Petroleum Institute. They say there's enormous benefits to using fossil fuels, and if fossil fuel use were to end tomorrow, the economic consequences would be catastrophic. So this is much more of an apocalyptic style scenario, and again, much more aggressive than the utilities tend to do. And then the third one I'll talk about is the real estate industry. So they were pretty narrowly focused on energy efficiency laws. This is a quote from the Greater Boston Real Estate Board. They're saying increasing energy efficiency and having home energy efficiency labeling would cause a widening of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So this is a social justice sounding argument, which was somewhat common among the real estate industry. We did not see any social justice groups or individuals making these kinds of arguments, but this is kind of a tactic that the real estate industry is trying to use to stop these kinds of bills.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about who wins and loses in the legislature out of these sort of clusters of interest groups that we've identified. So again, there are 9 clusters. You can see their names here. And by the way, we welcome later in the chat or in the breakout rooms at questions about these particular clusters, because we've had to just sort of brush over them. But the way we try to answer this question about who wins or loses is to look at, when a member of one of these clusters lobbies for or against a bill, how much more likely is that bill to then move forward out of the committee it's in? Or if it's up for a floor vote, how likely is it to be passed? And so basically, what's the effect of one extra lobby for or against a bill from one of these coalitions on our predicted probability of it moving forward in the legislature? So what we find is that the utilities coalition is far and away the most successful in that its lobbying tends to coincide with the movement of the bill forward or with bills dying in committee if they're opposed to them. There are other coalitions that are statistically significantly successful in the legislature. So conservation and planning coalitions, and you can sort of see that because there were major bills passed to do with sustainable development over this time period, and fossil and chemical coalitions as well have a sort of a weaker signal, but still significant. We want to look at literally draw a picture of what that kind of success in the legislature looks like. So I just want to quickly brush up everyone, we probably all know this, on how bills move through the legislature. Bills are introduced and then referred to joint committees based on the topic of the bill. And then those joint committees can send them further on in the legislature to what we're calling here gateway committees. So the Senate or House Ways and Means committees. They might get passed around a little, and then ultimately some go up for floor votes. And if they pass, then they are either signed or vetoed by the governor. What we see here is a flow diagram showing all the bills in all the almost 300 bills in our data set and their movement through the legislature. So they're all introduced. They go to either the Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee, or a smaller set of them go to other committees. Then some of them make their way through those joint committees to the Ways and Means, and even fewer of them make their way to a floor vote, and then nearly all of those were signed by the governor. So we don't have very much information about what actually goes on at these crucial points. So we don't really know much about the deliberations that go on in joint committees. We have some records of the public hearings that they have. We know basically nothing about what goes on in the House Ways and Means Committee. We have votes from the Senate Ways and Means Committee, but nothing about their, no records of deliberations or anything. And then even on some floor votes, we don't know who actually voted for which bill because of how those votes are recorded in the legislature. But what we do have is lobbying positions on many of these bills. So I'm going to color in this flow diagram based on the position that utilities interest groups lobbied on the bills at each stage in the legislature. And I'm going to explain what we see. Okay, so I've colored this in so that red lines indicate that they opposed those bills, green indicate that they supported them, blue that they were lobbied neutrally on them, and gray that they didn't lobby on them. What we see is that at the beginning of each session, there are a ton of bills related to climate change introduced and sent to joint committees, and utilities overwhelmingly oppose them or have some neutral lobbying on them. Then a much smaller number of bills makes their way out of those committees, and you can see there's an immediate change in the distribution of utilities lobbying. So the bills that make their way out of committee are overwhelmingly supported by utilities. Now, by the time we get to the bills that make their way to a floor vote or get signed, and there were, I think, 7 bills over our time period that were signed, nearly all of them are supported by the Utilities Coalition. So there's only one bill that made it that far that had net opposition. So this is just sort of a picture of what does it mean to win in the legislature? It means that as bills filter their way up, those bills that match the utilities' preferences tend to move forwards, and others tend to die. Okay, I'll hand it back to Trevor to just quickly review.
Yeah, so I know we're almost at time, so this is just a kind of a summary slide. We can talk more about this. Just answering our research question here. We see who supports and opposes climate and clean energy legislation. We see a green coalition led by environmental groups, and we see an anti-green coalition led by utilities. For what their preferences are and what they want, utilities are supporting some large-scale renewable energy, but strongly attacking solar. We see the fossil fuel industry is really looking to block pretty much any and all new climate policy in the state. We see the real estate industry is pretty focused on energy efficiency laws. And we see that the power generators are mostly attacking new renewable energy supply that would threaten existing supply. And then when we look at who are the winners and losers, utilities are by far the biggest winners. We see this in the data. We also see this in interviews. Yeah, so they're really the biggest winners here. So with that, you can find our report online. I'll post a link to it in the chat, and we're really looking forward to the rest of the discussion and answering any questions you have.
I just got the link in the chat. We also have an academic article, which is just about to come out from a journal called Energy Research and Social Science. So it puts it in more of a perspective, and it does show what we've learned in Massachusetts is really path-breaking. Again, nobody's done this before in any other states, and we're now moving around the country, you know, starting next with Connecticut and then moving on, hopefully.
Yesterday, Massachusetts, tomorrow, Connecticut, the next day, the world.
The world, the Midwest.
Well, at least. So thank you. We're really lucky because now we're going to have a chance to hear what it's like to actually work in this culture that they have just set up. So much fun. So let us welcome Mike Connolly. He is a representative of the Middlesex 26th District. Now, let me just say, you can't see this, but Mike actually stands 6'8" tall, and he played football for Duke. Now, why do I bother to tell you that he played football for Duke? Because my kid played football, and I did everything I could to dissuade him. I said, darling, our people, we become doctors, lawyers, CPAs. We don't do this kind of thing. But I will say he taught me one of the greatest lessons of my life, because from football, he learned how important rules were. He learned what a real role model is, not a fake one. And he learned how to pick himself up and be persistent. And Mike Connolly has learned all of these things in spades. So glad you played, Mike. He got his degree from Boston College. And when he was there, when he was there, he was a staff writer and an editor for the Journal of Law and Social Justice. He was a founder and campaign manager of Net Zero Cambridge. He worked with Occupy, and he has worked to try to create and pass really progressive legislation within the culture you just heard about. And he will spend the next 10 minutes sharing what that's like with us. Mike Connolly, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Judith, for that generous introduction. I'm going to set my timer here so I can have a sense of where I'm at in the 10 minutes. And also let me say thank you to the authors from Brown University. It really is an encouraging, at least encouraging in terms of giving us some information, but somewhat and rather discouraging report in terms of the stark realities that it lays out. And before I begin my remarks, I also do want to take a moment to acknowledge the allegations that were made by a survivor of workplace harassment who came forward recently, and to recognize that 350 Mass has initiated an independent investigation, and that this is a minimal yet important first step toward accountability. I want to elevate the recent comments made by workers of the Better Future Project and volunteers in their May 3rd letter to the board, and just assert that we all need to take issues of mistreating workers and volunteers in the movement seriously, because it hurts individuals, it hurts the collective movement, and it contributes to delays on climate action. Having said that, when it comes to the legislature, I think there's many angles to it. On the one hand, I know that we have passed significant climate legislation in each of the last 4 sessions, technically, when you think about it. And that's remarkable, because it's rare for the legislature to pass comprehensive bills on the same topic in back-to-back sessions. And I'm talking about the 2016 Comprehensive Energy Diversity Bill, the 2018 Act to Advance Clean Energy, then the last section, the Next Generation Roadmap Climate Law, which we ended up passing over and over and over again because our governor vetoed it and rejected parts of it. And so that actually brings us up to this session where we passed the bill over again. Now, to be very clear, I'm wearing my Green New Deal sweatshirt, t-shirt. I'm not here to try to sell you on the idea that any of these bills are sufficient, because they're not. Nothing that has happened on the state level here, nothing that I've seen in any level of state government truly meets, that Green New Deal vision and meets the climate imperative, which, as I understand it, really means that we are running out of time this decade to stop burning fossil fuels. And we understand quite well that there's a budget of carbon and that we can't fool around. We need transformation. And really that gets to not just climate policy, but that gets to the structure of our economy. I don't think this is going to happen unless we are willing to look to the very wealthy, unless we're willing to look to the very powerful and say we are going to have to restructure some things and redistribute some wealth and power in order to achieve a sustainable framework that'll give us a shot at saving humanity. Regarding the conversation and to Judith's point about, what is it like to work in this system? I've often said that, rule number one is you have to understand the rules. And rule number two is there are no rules. And by that, I mean, at the end of the day, a majority of legislators, if a majority decide to do anything, then it can be done. Any rule can be waived. Any motion can be doubted. And if a majority of people agree with it, it can just happen. And so I think it is very important to uplift and highlight the work that's being done to promote transparency. I'm one of I think three or four now, members of the House who have fully signed on to the People's House campaign. And I know that number, I hope, will be growing. And I know different reps have signed on to individual pieces of it. But, that isn't sufficient in its own right, just changing the rules. And another thing that we can do, I think, is work with legislators, people who are truly committed to not just being, I think of myself as an activist legislator. So I want to do the work of being a legislator. I want to do the work of being an activist. People tell me it can't be done, but that's the goal. And I think for us to actually change this dynamic, that's what we're going to need more of. And, I do want to say it is amazing what can be done when we develop, effective partnerships with individual and hopefully groups and caucuses of legislators. And that's because, I think of where we're at, we're never going to have more power than all those interests that were listed by the researchers and by the authors of the study. Big industry and the billionaire class in corporate America, are inherently more organized and more powerful than us. But we can win. And I think, a lot of times that requires, I think legislators can help in that, because I think of, back in the Revolutionary War when they were doing the Battle of Bunker Hill, they said, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Now, why did they say that? It was because, one side just didn't have the firepower of the other side. And so they had to make a strategic decision that they understood the battlefield, they understood the playing field, and they were like, we have to plan on when we're going to take, our one shot at making a change. And I think, we can do that with the climate movement as well. We can do that with this agenda. I can tell you that leadership is terrified of the possibility of having to vote on, real concrete substantive policies. They don't want to find themselves in a position where they would have to vote against what we know, and we know this because of the work of so many of you on this call. We know that voters and constituents want bold climate action. And so that's why, in addition to changing the rules, we also, I think, have to be, very proactive in imagining the playing field. When are the opportunities that we will have a chance to put things to a vote? And we have to organize proactively around that. And, another point that I'd give of feedback is, in terms of the Green Coalition, there's a wide disparity among those groups. And there are certain groups that, are in our coalition and they're our allies, but, their attitude would very much be, let's operate with a permission structure from leadership. Then there are other groups that, are more on an activist approach, but, they may not be able to get the right strategy together in the right time. And then when they realize what's happening, it may be too late to affect the outcome. So I guess in the final couple of minutes, that I have left, again, what I would emphasize is, really the value in planning ahead proactively. It's not enough to wait until an announcement is made that a bill is going to be coming forward to the floor for a vote, and then at that point deciding our strategy. What we need to do is work with legislators who are truly interested in taking on these power structures, and then we need to plan proactively and have our amendments drafted, have our legislation drafted, and then do what we can to create our own timelines and our own narratives. So for example, I've met with people in Act on Mass going back to the start of the organization a few years ago. And, I really emphasized to them, if you get 5, 10 legislators to stand together and say, this is our agenda, this is our plan, all of a sudden, that group is controlling the narrative. That's something to talk about. And so I think, the types of things that we should be thinking about in terms of forcing our agenda is sort of putting things on timelines, for example. So for example, we could say, within the next 18 months, we want to have a vote on the 100% renewable energy amendment that we feel meets the moment and that we feel is sufficient. And this is what it's going to look like, and this is what it's going to be about. And then go out and do that organizing, engaging the public, engaging constituents, also engaging some of those other climate groups that may not be interested in such an aggressive strategy, looking to bring them on board, and then really putting people on notice, having that proposal vetted, for example. You can't just draft the proposal in 24 or even 72 hours, but really having the proposal vetted. And then when the moment comes, that is when, everyone's on notice, all the organizing has been done, and effort could be made to really force an issue. Take, for example, bills that get sent to study, right? Just because a bill gets sent to study doesn't mean that it's dead. The study actually comes back to the floor of the House, and it has to be accepted by the body. Now, normally that's a pro forma thing, but if you actually got a majority of legislators to agree that we wanted to see a bill pass, irregardless of what the committee chair decides, irregardless of what some opaque vote might be, then that type of plan can actually be executed. So that's my timer. So I'll stop there. And again, I think I would summarize my remarks by saying, rule number 1, we have to know the rules, and I fully agree we have to change the rules. And then rule number 2 is added above and beyond that. There are no rules other than building the political power and the partnerships to get a majority of the legislature to do what we want. And if we can do that, we can overcome any procedural hurdle there is. So thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. It's interesting. William Lloyd Garrison used to say in the 1850s, politicians stand in sand. They wait for the electorate to push them. So we are going to use the 109 brilliant minds on this call to generate ideas out of what we have just heard from Mike, Timmons, Galen, and Trevor. Because what are we? We are activists, and what we do is then move on information and try to support people like Mike to make important climate legislation happen. So what we have set up are 10 breakout rooms. And when you go into them, I'll tell you what they are in a second. And actually, you could probably just go ahead, you see the little 4 squares near the bottom of your screen touch that. And it should list the breakout rooms. Sam, does that list the breakout rooms? Okay, yeah, it'll tell you which one you want to go to. So we have 10 breakout rooms on 5 different topics. And what we would want you to do is to think about what you've just learned. Who is going to push against the legislation that we know has to happen? Given what you've just learned, what are some ideas for circumventing that, allying it, or pushing through it? So for instance, allying it, I can only imagine that if you really had a good talk with the real estate industry so that they realize that their objectives and ours are the same. We want them to stay in business. We want them to maintain a housing market that can meet the future. So that truly are, that you think maybe if you know how to approach people, you can ally them. Sometimes you got to go around them and sometimes push through, and we're going to come up with those ideas. So here are our 5 breakout groups. Housing retrofits, 1 million of them. The legislation has pretty much been created by Mark Dian, who will run one of those breakout rooms, and Cabell Ames, who is our great legislative leader. So you can choose one of those. Statewide based building codes and stretch codes, and retrofits for business and industry. We are really lucky to have Sarah Dooling, who is the executive director of MCAN, and Kurt Newton from our planning group. Transportation. How are we going to electrify all the fleets, which we absolutely have to do? Improve mass transit, change the culture from individual driving to using that mass transit. And the people that are going to lead you to ask those questions, think about who gets in the way and how to address them, are Lucia Dolan and Steve Miller, both from our 350 transportation group. If we're going to electrify everything, we obviously have to green the grid. 100% renewables, I believe that's what Mike just talked about. And talking about how to get that passed, we are very lucky to have Andra Rose from Mothers Out Front and Maria Wilkins from our planning group. And then finally, full legislative transparency. And I know you've heard from them, from Act on Mass. How do we get those term limits? How do we see every single vote? So what we're going to do is ask someone from each breakout room. I'll collate all the brilliant ideas you came up with. So just an idea about some of the ideas that came up. Who will speak for Mark Dian's housing retrofit group? Speak up, unmute yourself, and share.
We talked about the John Grossman started us off by saying, okay, what does this information from the ground group do to change what we're already doing? What do we learn from this? And we had a good discussion about how to frame the issue, the importance of figuring out, of sort of both dealing with the opposition's arguments and also highlighting who the opposition is, rather than sort of getting into the weeds on their arguments. The argument was made in our group that if you name who's opposing us, most people are not going to say, oh, they're the ones who are on the side of working and poor people. So it's both countering their arguments and also going around them to talk about who the opponent is.
So staying on target. Great. Kabul, want to talk a little bit about what your group came up with, or whoever the assigned person from that group is? Again, housing retrofits.
Yes, sure. So we had a robust discussion. You know, it was first reactions, it was feelings, it was, were people aware that this was going on? And so really we had a robust discussion mainly about not knowing. And then kind of we drilled down into the why that they would be lobbying against. And so, you know, basically at the end, we just kind of came out with some actions that we really do need to reach out to our partners who are real estate agents, our friends, and ask them to help us whenever the testimony time comes up. It would be wonderful to have real estate agents testifying on the retrofit bills, any energy efficiency bills for that matter. But we need to show that the real estate industry does not oppose this, that if they are submitting testimony, it is behind the backs of those that are doing the work and selling the homes, and that they are not on board with it, that the real estate agents want climate action, want energy efficiency. And if we can prove that there is a divide, then it takes away the narrative. And so when I met with the Secretary of Housing last week, his question to me was, how does the real estate industry feel about housing bills? And I said, well, you know, they submit testimony, but they don't submit it, but they submit it privately, not publicly. So there's definitely a rift. And I believe that we can show that rift in a public manner if we reach out to our friends, we ask for quotes, we have them show up, we have them write the LTEs, and we have them be the voice that the real estate industry wants climate action and energy efficiency bills to pass now.
Wonderful. Shift the narrative. Yay. We put the statewide groups together. So Sarah's and Kurt's were together. Who would like to report out on statewide base codes, stretch codes, business and industry?
I can certainly report out unless somebody else from the group would like to do that.
Oh, go to.
All right, let's go to then. So similar to Cowell's group, we talked initially about some of the narratives of delay, and in our breakout session, we talked about where was the media in all of this, and how can we work more closely with journalists in dispelling these falsehoods around the connection between a potential net zero stretch code and then our opening remarks and the ability of that stretch code to choke the production of affordable housing. We moved on to talking more specifically about commercial and industrial building sectors and the need to coordinate resources and share information in a more efficient and consistent way. And that communications, we have to be able to recognize the patterns of these discourses, both in the media and in these lobbying publications and comments, and be better able to strategize ahead of time against this misinformation, and really begin to listen to people on the ground, practitioners and building owners and others about their what their barriers are in doing a retrofit or in thinking about going to net zero. And that there are a lot of states around the country doing similar work to what we want to be able to do in Massachusetts, you know, groups in New York, in Connecticut just recently, and really emphasizing that this is doable and having a balance between putting pressure on our legal and regulatory sides while also building our advocacy base. And the question was, we ended our discussion, got cut off, but the question was, where is the battle? And that's a question in the singular. And so I think, where are the battles? And so the battles are now happening both at the local level and at the state level. And we have to hold the state accountable, DOER specifically, in terms of its 2022 timeline for development of a net zero stretch code. So many of the ideas that Mark and Cabell put forward tonight fall similarly into some of our buckets of discussion.
Yeah, and on both of these issues, having the carrot and the stick so that we also have incentives to help business and homeowners. All right, transportation. Lucia, would you or someone from your group like to report out?
Sure, I'm happy to go. The interesting thing was we had quite a few people from the West western part of the state. And we started out with what are the arguments used against funding transportation? And cost is always the big one, and people wanting to be individuals and be able to like go anywhere they can, anytime they want with their own car, as opposed to using mass transit. And two of the things we said about that is, one, there's a lot of hidden costs with individual cars, maintaining the roads and also maintaining the police and the ambulance services. There's the equity issue of who can afford a car. And then with EV cars, there was some question on whether or not the batteries are a big problem with, being abandoned and polluting, waste and all that sort of stuff, and whether or not that's true. There seems to be news out there that the batteries can be used as backup power supply once they're no longer used for cars. That's like something we have to research. We weren't really 100% sure on that. And then overall, I was really impressed by the last speaker saying how to plan ahead so you're ready for what's coming. And somebody in our group, Downing, said that housing in general is much more focused. They have a clear mission, the groups, of what they want, and they seem to be moving farther ahead faster. And that's something that I think transportation needs to work on.
Right. And what you said was there are no free rides. When you are creating energy, the only free ride is conservation. So even with electric vehicles, there are always going to be problems, and we simply have to address them. Steve, your group.
Yes, hi. We started also by looking at what were the strongest arguments that the automobile fossil fuel industry were going to make, and how do we turn them around to attack what they think are their strong points, to reveal their weaknesses. But that also quickly led to a discussion of the problems with rural areas and the importance for most people in the continuing foreseeable future of their individual cars, that we're just not going to ramp up public transportation at the rate that's going to make private individuals give up their cars very quickly. Stephen Magnolia pointed out that the automobile industry has committed to going electric rather fast. And so the big question is going to be, who owns and distributes the charging infrastructure? Is that going to be done by private sector companies with all the inequities that that's going to create? Or can we use that as an argument for public sector outreach of creating a transportation infrastructure? And what strikes me as we're finishing that is that might be a bridge, one of the few I know of, between the desire to electrify and expand mass transit in the urban areas and the ability to have a good argument for why government public action is needed in the rural areas as well. That we need to frame this as a public infrastructure mission that helps everybody to reduce inequities and to improve the environment, as well as lower the individual costs on families in general and poor families in specific. So I think what came out of our conversation, although it wasn't always so coherent at the time, is maybe a way to frame this for the first time of bringing together both the rural areas and the urban areas into a public progressive agenda.
Nice. And our local rep is working on high-speed rail for the whole nation. Right, your mouth to God's ears. Now, if we're going to electrify everything, we have got to have a green grid. And Andra Rose, would you like to speak, or someone from your group, what you talked about greening the grid and creating a 100% renewable energy?
Yeah, so we heard and I think the people had some opinions about not including certain kinds of so-called renewables. Biomass was mentioned, and the idea that cutting down forests for solar was a good idea was questioned. And then we turned to how we get to the you know, the power that lobbyists from the opponents have in terms of money and their influence. Galen was in our group and mentioned that, you know, it's not just a matter of money, it's that they're seen, the industry representatives are seen as the experts. So that turned us to look at, well, we have experts, you know, how do we get them both in the room with activists and mobilized? And so there were some ideas about that. And then also to make it a political liability to be influenced by lobbyists, but then we need that transparency in order to get the schedules and who they met with and what that testimonies in private was. We talked about getting our legislators to be champions within the State House, and you know, activists like Mike Connolly is, and and then something that we talked some about solar and how it is or isn't a developed workforce. Some people felt like, you know, we need more troubleshooters in the industry to help people, maybe coaches, is what was meant. And then we focused on towns' power to, you know, say, declare a climate emergency and tie that to setting certain goals and then bringing that to the State House collectively and really using the power we have, which is greater at the local level, to influence the politics at the state level. So I think that covered a lot of it.
Pretty efficient. There's some really interesting stuff in the chat too, where people are talking about things like biomass, hydro, and nuclear, which all have huge issues attached to them. And yes, well, biomass actually does give off a lot of CO2, and the others are carbon free, but they have their own issues. And so, yeah, how do you get through? And in Germany, interestingly, so their government has been supporting local energy production instead of centralized energy production. And that's nothing that we have really looked at yet. And our energy companies will not love that. Maria, who's going to speak for your team? That was the other 100% renewable group. Maria Wilkins, are you there, my dear?
I'm here. I am. I just have to get my my Google Doc back.
Yeah, there you go. You figured it out.
Okay. So we similar conversations. We started talking about some of the areas in which some of the benefits we got from the roadmap bill, at least as a pathway in terms of areas that we can work on. We have a new mandate for offshore wind, and we know we're going to get our local utilities to work with us on that, but we know we're going to get a lot of flack from the gas companies. In addition, we were looking at some barriers that people have been confronting in their own communities, having to do particularly around solar, where Monty talked about in some communities, because of the extra energy that solar panels put on the grid, they're making the homeowners pay for transformers. There must be a way that we can start, dealing with those little incremental changes. And also DOER is proposing to lower the SRECs. So even within our framework, we're recognizing of the new roadmap bill, there are things like the new RPS things that makes biofuels part of the RPS that we're going to have to be fighting back. And that was another thing that we ended up dealing with in terms of knowing what the enemy or our opponents are saying, because they're saying them mostly behind closed doors. Around the roadmap bill, we know that the real estate industry said that the new flex code would stop affordable housing in its tracks. And we were able to counter that argument because we knew what it was. But sometimes understanding what the argument is and so that you can counter it and also name the names of the groups that are doing that is another thing we need to start doing with our reps to find out better how to deal with the kind of opposition and greenwashing that's going on.
Right. And the other thing Andra mentioned, getting experts, and so very briefly, 3 Brahmins and a fellow with common sense are walking down the road because they've been asked to be a prince's consultant. And each one is discussing their great knowledge. They're talking about string theory and physics and theological information. And the poor fellow with common sense is just trying to think about how he would apply all those things. And because he's from a lower caste, they look down on him. They find a pile of bones. And the first one says, aha, I have got a lot of anthropological history, and I think that's a Bengal tiger. The second one says, I know how to put flesh and organs back on the animal. And the third says, I can reanimate. And the fellow with common sense says, are you sure you want to bring alive a Bengal tiger? And they all went, what do you know? So the first one assembled the bones, the second one put in the organs and blood, and as the third one is beginning to reanimate, the fellow with common sense climbs up a tree. The tiger, which had been dead for a long time, goes, and after it finished eating the 3 Brahmins, the fellow with common sense came back down, and he got to be the prince's advisor. Each Brahmin was an expert in his field. And as Andra brought up, it is really important that we keep them together and we help them broaden that knowledge to look at the big picture. And our final big picture notes will be offered from our Act on Mass team, Erin and Ella. Erin, want to start?
Sure, I love that story. So we all pretty much agreed right away that the committee process needs reform. I think we're all really blown away, especially by that chart that shows the giant block of bills being filed at the beginning of the session and how it's mostly those climate-friendly bills. And then when they go to committee, suddenly very, very few of them make it out, and the proportion of climate-friendly bills just drops. And we all seem to agree also pretty quickly that the big route to solving all of this has to start with public awareness and just making sure that everyone has the opportunity that we had tonight to realize what's really going on in there in the State House. And I know that I'm currently running a campaign to do like just that. I didn't feed this to them, I promise. But also to generally then take that public awareness and kind of put it towards public pressure on the representatives, because like Rep. Connolly said, the rules matter, but they don't matter if you've got 51% of the reps on your side. So how can we get those 51% of reps on our side on this issue? And ultimately, just like voters deserve to know what's going on in those committees, who's making the decisions and why, they also deserve to know what their rep stance is on reforming the committee process and transparency. So how to kind of make that more of a factor that voters can consider at the ballot box, right? When they're choosing who's going to be representing their views. Yeah, it was a really good group. We also talked about the possibility of circumventing all of the legislators and just doing something like by a ballot referendum, which I know is a very popular and exciting idea. And we even started kind of organizing and brainstorming messaging at the end. It was really good to have a group that just seemed ready to go already.
Nice. Ella, anything different in your group?
Yeah, so we talked like similarly about the committee process and how it needs to be more transparent. Lynn also brought up a great point, which is that there's especially lack of transparency in in these lobby meetings, and not being able to know who our representatives are meeting with, which lobbyists are influencing their decisions. And especially when we saw that really striking chart where you see the amount of testimony that the public gave and the amount of testimony that the fossil fuel corporations gave, So they had a question for the Brown folks. I don't know if they're still here, but if there's any way to see sort of how like who our legislators are meeting with and which corporations and lobbyists they're meeting with. My guess is no, because then we talked about like public records law and how the legislature has exempted itself from public records law, and that being another barrier. But we had a great discussion about sort of the culture shift that needs to happen in order to have a more transparent legislature. So we talked about the barriers we've seen from the speaker, and even and especially in the Progressive Caucus, the pushback against transparency, and how we need to shift the culture so that reps feel that there's more pressure to be accountable to their constituents than there is pressure to be accountable to the speaker. We talked about the electoral process, and how that sort of factors into everything, right? And the opportunity to make transparency a really defining issue in the next round of state legislature elections in 2022. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything, if anyone in my group wants to add, but it was a really great discussion.
So I'm going to leave you with a very short story about Ron Mariano and relevant to Act en Masse. A number of years ago, when he was still a rep, he was being interviewed by Janet Wu from WCVB. And she said, people have noticed that you take lunches on tap, on the Hill that cost $750, $1,000. He goes, oh, don't worry. The citizens aren't paying for that. That's paid for by banks and insurance companies. She said, well, aren't they doing that to leverage influence? Well, of course. Well, do they? Sometimes. You got to give him points for honesty. And that is our legislature. So I want to thank Timmons, Trevor, Galen, give them all a big yay. Everyone that ran a breakout group, we will be putting all that information together, and we will exit to politics and poker. Thank you, everybody.